I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
Those who are most marginalized know the most about the true, the good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm your co-host, Dean Detloff.
And I'm your other co-host, Matt Bernico.
Matt, it's the end of the world as we know it, and people are not feeling fine. But I've got a great recommendation for you if you too are not feeling fine at the end of this world. Matt and I spent the last year writing a book, and it wades directly into our climate apocalypse and many other apocalypses. It's called Enough is Enough: Degrowth, Capitalism, and Liberation Theology. And I think it's going to be pretty good reading for folks who are kind of on the deck of the Titanic right now, trying to figure out whether or not you should join the band and keep playing or go out on to sea. I'm painting a very grim picture of pre-ordering a book that we wrote, but I don't know, it just feels like a bad time all around. But I do think the book will give you a little spark of joy. Matt, what do you think? How can we make this book more appealing than making people feel like they should read it despite having no hope?
Okay, here's the thing. When it comes to big policies around the climate, when it comes to people suggesting political fixes, there's so much wishy-washiness in the world. There's so much but if we do this, then this other thing will happen, says some stupid nerd who's probably been elected to fix this problem for you or whatever. But this book is full of very clear and authoritative moral reasons we should be caring about the environment, about people who are affected by environmental catastrophe. And that's why you should read it. We need strong, definitive moral takes about the climate and how to fix it. And boy, have we got a book full of them. You can get this book and all of these great authoritative takes by going to fortresspress.com or basically any other website that sells books. They've all got it. And search for the book, Enough is Enough: Degrowth, Capitalism, and Liberation Theology. You'll find it out there. It's $24 US, but only 16 Great British pounds. So if you come to the UK, you can get it for a little bit cheaper. Not in fact, but it does feel like a little bit cheaper. The exchange rate is brutal. It's not really cheaper, but it does feel that way. So that's great.
Yeah, that's right. The unelected nerd, or the elected nerds, sorry, they're coming up with bad ideas, but us unelected nerds, we're coming up with good ideas. So go ahead and read that book, and we'll all figure out how to survive this weird moment together. That's enough for this brief advertisement for ourselves. Now we're back to the good stuff, the things that everybody has been listening to the show to hear, and that is content about the Book of Revelation, and we are at the end of a book about the end of times. Pablo Richard's Apocalypse, a people's commentary on the Book of Revelation. It's been weeks that we've been listening to this great Chilean theologian tell us all kinds of weird ideas about the weirdest book in the Bible, and it's bittersweet to get to the end of it. It's, on the one hand, kind of nice to have a break from just reading about the weirdest stuff I've ever heard of. And on the other hand, I feel kind of excited to really get into the utopian vision, the final political alternative delivered to us by John F. Patmos, one of the weirdest guys to ever do it. Matt, how do you feel at the end of this book before we get into what's actually going on in it?
Surprisingly positive. I don't want to say anything that's going on in it, as you mentioned. We'll talk about it in a minute. But I think that the end of the book ends in a really cool way. that gives you a lot of insight for how to live amongst the end times. It also has a section where an angel tells birds to eat everybody. So kind of got away what's going on here, the good and the bad. Well, I don't know. Bad is a matter of perspective. If you're a hungry bird, then this book is going to get you going. You're going to love how this one ends.
That's right. This is truly a book for the birds when you think about it, actually, Revelation. So you can take that with you. We are talking in particular about Revelation 19:11 to 22:5, and I guess kind of whatever else is left over. It is the final bit, but as we know from Pablo Richard, it's the final stuff, but it's pulling in, absorbing lots of other stuff happening that we've talked about already in the book of Revelation, in the prophetic tradition of the Bible. And it is kind of nice to see all the threads finally come together in one big, wild, utopian vision for the future. I thought we could start with just going through how Richard breaks down the actual biblical text, and then we can pull out the parts that we actually want to talk through or find ourselves drawn to. But in some of the past chapters, it's been harder to do that because Richard will be like, I'm going to tell you about, 13 chapters at a time or whatever. You can't do that in a podcast. But this one, you can, and it's the end. So let's go through the sequence of events here. So we have, in the beginning of the future of history, as Richard calls it. There is first a judgment on the beast, the false prophet, and the kings of the earth. All the bad guys that you have been sick of reading about because they're doing all kinds of awful stuff. They finally get judged. They are judged as Christ also comes on a white horse, which is not, as we learned, the same as the pale horse rider, but has some interesting echoes going on there. Then comes God's great feast, or the good news for the birds moment. There is then war and annihilation, a scary moment in the Bible. After the beast, false prophet, and kings of the earth are judged in this way, there's a judgment of Satan and a 1,000-year reign of Christ. So Satan is tied up for 1,000 years. And during that 1,000 years, Christ and the martyrs are able to reign over a kind of brief utopia. And then, wouldn't you know it, there's another war and annihilation. So that's bad news. There's then a judgment over the dead, death, and Hades. So at the end of the war, there's kind of a, final revolutionary justice here. God is then seated on the white horse, he's seated on a white throne. It's not a horse. And there is judgment over the dead. Then there is the final annihilation of death, Hades, and those condemned. And then we hear the future of history, the new heavens and the new earth, and the new Jerusalem. We get to learn about the description of what's going on there, parts of the city, the forms and measures, the materials used to make the city, all the details are there. And then finally, there's the presence of God and the Lamb that fill the city. So we're finally at the end here. The last judgment has come. It was not actually the 7 bowls and the 7 trumpets. Those were only little judgments. This is the judgment of all the judgment to end all judgment. And boy, is there a lot of judgment going on here. Matt, where do you want to dig in on this extremely wild series of events?
Wow, so many things to say. Yeah, you're right. So we had the 7 bowls, the 7 trumpets, and this is the events that take place in this portion of Revelation are the 7th trumpet. This is like the real last bit. I feel like Revelation is always like, this is going to be the end, and then it's not quite the end. Okay, cool. So maybe just an overview of like what is going on in this section of Revelation. Richard kicks things off saying that you're guessing. You've been thinking this whole time that this is a book about the end of the world. This is where it all winds down finally. But Richard has a whole nother tact, and he says this is not the end of the world, but this is a story or an ending about what brings an end to suffering and oppression. So not the end of the world in the total ultimate sense of like total like annihilation or obliteration or something. This is about the end of suffering and oppression. So an important distinction. It's not the end of the world, but it is the end of the world for some people. The bad guys.
The end of a world.
And there's other worlds possible, the New Jerusalem and so on. So Richard argues that Revelation is ultimately a like consciousness raising text, and when we know like what is going to happen in the future, that the oppressed will judge all of the oppressors, God will deliver on that judgment, the birds will eat everyone's bodies, and so on. That should change how we act in the present. So this is like peeking behind the curtain to see how things are actually going to go, and this should change the way that we act in the world, and act against the empire and for liberation. So we'll see if we feel that way at the end. I feel that way, but maybe you won't. Okay, so here are some big picture ideas from Richard. There's a heading in this chapter, as there are in all of the chapters so far, called Keys for Interpreting the Text. So let's turn the first key here. Richard says, before looking at each part of the Book of Revelation in detail, it's important to make it clear that the structure of the text that we have examined does not represent a chronological order, a schedule, or a plan. So tell your pastor that you can stop trying to like map it all out in the corkboard, though we won't stop trying now. It's a good note. Richard continues and says, it is a logic rather than a chronology and depicts the logic of God's final intervention in history. It's eschatological rather than chronological. It shows us the ultimate direction of history, where we're headed, and how the present age comes to an end. Okay, so that's it. This is not about a chronological timeline of events, though I guess it is kind of laid out that way in our brains. In the Left Behind series, that's what you get. You have all of these kind of moving parts in history. This prophecy needs to be fulfilled before that, but that is not what's happening in this book. It's all kind of a little bit wibbly wobbly in a Doctor Who kind of way. So Richard goes on to say that the future is anticipated. Likewise, the revelation of the future of history is not intended to satisfy unhealthy curiosity, that's all of us bored in church, but to make us live the present in a different way. The importance of having a utopia lies not in the utopia itself, but in how this utopia guides our present history and practice. So, like I mentioned a minute ago, right, the whole point of this book is not to know the future, is not to be able to predict events. It is about understanding the flow of history, like the grand narrative of history and God's place in that history and our place in that history, and the way that oppression works as sort of like a key pivot point for that historical world. And knowing a little bit about how this history works, that in the end, God wins, oppression ceases, all of the kings of the earth and Hades and Satan and death are all defeated. That should tell us something about how we engage politically, how we stop, suffering from happening, and how we deal with liberation. That ultimately we win in the end, I guess is like the moral of the story, which is really interesting. I wish I could know like what it must have felt like to be in one of those one of those churches in Asia Minor from the beginning, and then somebody tell you that you're suffering now, you're dealing with the empire, it's all really awful, you're on the very margins, you're not participating, you're not taking up the mark of the beast and buying things at the market or whatever, you're not doing idolatrous stuff, and it sucks right now, but in the end you'll win. I guess I wonder how that would change my brain, and I suppose I should know, right? I suppose like that's still kind of the case, but I don't feel any better off knowing that God wins the end or something. I would like to win right now, please.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, contextually too, as we know, this is a book that is for a church of martyrs. The idea is that, like, in losing, you will ultimately win. That's kind of the advice here. And I do think there's interesting contradictions in the Book of Revelation that I'm sure we'll kind of keep talking about over time. One of the primary ones is, Jesus, he dies on the cross, and most of the time, Christianity, even in the New Testament, interprets that as the kind of victory over death that also changes what we expect from victory, or like the fact that Jesus dies as a martyr kind of should alter what we expect when we think about what it means to kind of triumph over the power of empire. So whereas you might think, if you're like a revolutionary in the tradition of the Maccabees or something, that what you really need is like an armed peasant rebellion, Jesus is doing something a bit different, being like, well, you're just going to get crushed like the Maccabees. And so maybe there's this alternative way of building power through collective collective organizing and kind of sharing and, carving out an alternative space within the empire. There's a kind of weird way in which Revelation, the author of Revelation, kind of gets that point. So he's kind of understanding that, Jesus changes the valuations. It's a transvaluation of values in the book of Revelation, where the martyrs who are thrown away by the empire, those are actually the strongest people in the world, and the emperor, the Caesar, the people that everybody says who could confront the beast, those forces will eventually be destroyed, even though they pretend to eternity. So that kind of reversal of values is there. But there is this kind of weird way in which the point is not really to completely undo the logic of winner take all battle, but instead to just change the terms of who wins it. So, Jesus doesn't lead an armed revolution or something, but in the end, metaphysically, there will be this huge giant war, and in fact there will be this kind of armed confrontation, although it's armed in a complicated way. So all that to say, I don't think that it's as simple as saying the book of Revelation just puts the oppressor in the position of the oppressed and is ultimately only a kind of text of resentment. But I do think that sometimes it is that, that spirit sort of comes through. So I think what Richard is doing by saying there is this kind of utopian dimension at least helps us navigate those contradictions and maybe sort of provide a bit of an interpretive through line to be well, here's where Revelation is actually doing a good job of that, and here's where Revelation is also kind of bogged down by being written in a really violent empire dealing with all of that complicated backdrop or whatever. Anyway, I'm kind of rambling on here, but I think it's just kind of interesting to figure out how Richard is trying to negotiate those contradictions without necessarily allowing them to be contradictory in themselves.
Yeah, that's right. Well, we'll see how we feel at the end. How about that? It's tough. It's tough to just be yep, put on your helmet of salvation and pick up the sword of the Spirit, and that's gonna be good for now. But we'll get back to it. Okay. So within this part of Revelation, man, there's so much stuff that happens. We're not gonna be able to talk up through it all. If you are interested, you can go find this book yourself. It's on archive, but you could just buy it too. It's not that expensive even. Anyways, so the next beat in the story is the judgment upon the beast, the false prophet, the kings of the earth. That's great. We're gonna actually skip that part. It's mostly what you think. Jesus says, he's got all kinds of crowns on his head. Isn't that cool? Sort of demonstrating he's wielding political power. But the next thing we get is Christ on the white horse. Not to be confused with Christ on a bike. This one's different. Christ on the white horse. Okay, so Richard says that Jesus is riding a white horse. In 14:4, that's back further in Revelation, the Son of Man comes sitting on a white cloud, and in 20:11, God is seated on a white throne. White is a color that signifies victory. So one of the great metaphors and symbols within Revelation. In 6:2, however, we saw that the white horse, the first of four horses, represents the Roman Empire victorious through violence, economic exploitation, and death. You'll probably recall that from a few episodes ago. We talked about it a lot, and we liked the horses. We don't like what the horses were bringing. They're not great horses. These are the bad horses, if you can imagine such a thing. But the white horse in 6:2 is the polar opposite of this other white horse in 19:11, the one that Jesus is riding. Richard says that this is parallelism by antithesis. The rider of the white horse judges and wages war in righteousness rather than victory through barbarian sort of violence. That was the vibe back in 6:2. So the warrior image of Jesus, this is again Richard, is somewhat undone since he's presented as he's presented as unarmed. He does battle with his word alone. So this is quoting Psalms 2:9 and 19:15. And then Richard says that actually the word that's used is will shepherd. So he's trying to kind of cut down the apparentness of Jesus's warrior exterior, trying to demonstrate that Jesus is he's a warrior, but he's not that kind of warrior. Some interesting metaphor and symbolism. Dean, what do you think of this bit?
I agree. I think it is also interesting metaphor and symbolism. I think there is something kind of interesting about so the pale horse is the pale rider is on the white horse because the whiteness signifies victory, and so then Jesus is on the white horse because that's also a different kind of victory. And I do think that is quite interesting. The idea too that Jesus is like, I think as I was talking about a minute ago, kind of embodying these two desires, like on the one hand for the total victory over empire, which kind of echoes the empire in these complicated ways, or maybe even like parodies it in an interesting way. And then on the other hand, it does that, Jesus's victory is different from the victory of the pale horse, the white horse. I think the complicated thing is like, it kind of, it's different to a degree, but maybe not in quality. And what I mean by that is, we'll talk about this in a minute, but the fallout of Jesus's victory is in fact like a extreme destruction of lots of people on the earth, which is similar to the pale horse. The pale horse also is bringing about all this imperial destruction that's visited on people across social classes, etc. And I think that's kind of where Revelation struggles with its own vision of liberation. It's kind of parodying the empire on the one hand, because Jesus doesn't do the same thing that the Roman Empire does. And yet the effects are kind of troublingly, eerily similar. Lots of people are dead, and the carrion birds are able to feast on their corpses and all that kind of stuff. So, yeah, I think it's a complicated attempt at a kind of imperial parody, it seems to me.
Yeah, it is complicated. You're right. I think it's kind of at least for me as a reader, quite uncomfortable. But to make it even more complicated, let me throw this on the pile of complicated metaphors. Metaphors loaded with meaning, and it's kind of too much. So we've got Jesus. He's riding the horse. He has a sword coming out of his mouth. Great stuff. But not only that, but he is also clothed in a robe dipped in blood, and his name is called the Word of God. So on the one hand, it's we're trying to downplay in some ways the sort of violent nature of Jesus, or Richard is trying to do that. I'm not trying to do that. Mm-hmm. I would never do that. But Richard is trying to tell us time again that you have all this violent imagery, but actually, we're reading it wrong. We're not understanding the nuance. And in this case, Richard has a really interesting observation that I think is actually helpful in achieving his point of trying to demonstrate that Jesus is not, as violent as you might assume from this particular imagery. So Richard says, Jesus wears a cloak dipped in blood, but this is not the blood of his enemies. This is something different. This is actually Jesus's blood, or it's the blood of the martyrs. So Richard says this. This is a violent text, although the author of Revelation radically changes it in applying it to Jesus. He frees us and defeats his enemies by dying as a faithful martyr on the cross. The martyrs conquer Satan by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. His blood has freed us. He purchased us with his blood. The martyrs have washed their robes in the blood of the Lamb. The blood with which Jesus' garment is soaked is actually his own. He has a further argument, kind of walking through the trampling of the grapes of wrath and all this kind of stuff, and it's quite interesting. But I feel like it's not, that particular reading of this passage, that it's not Jesus's blood, is not obvious to me, and I figure Richard knows better, so I'll take his word for it. But if that's the case, it is actually really interesting then. So we have, like you're saying, kind of this parodying of the Pale Rider earlier that, conquers through just super violence. And then we have, Jesus on a white horse who conquers through righteousness, which is quite different.
Right.
But like you said, it does look a little similar, unless you know what to look out for.
Yeah. So that is a bit troubling. I mean, I guess that's a good excuse to get through the Great Feast bit, which is a spooky outcome. Okay, so Jesus. He came on the white horse. He's the weird warrior of God who doesn't wage war in the same way as the beast. And yet, here's kind of the outcome of the confrontation. So, Revelation starting 19:17. Then I saw an angel standing in the sun, and with a loud voice he called to all the birds that fly in mid-heaven, "Come gather for the great supper of God, to eat the flesh of kings, the flesh of captains, the flesh of the mighty, the flesh of the horses and their riders, flesh of all, both free and slave, both small and great." And then there's also, Richard points out that this great feast is the opposite of the wedding feast of the Lamb. So that's where God invites you to a different kind of feast. In any case, more to say about it. But, I mean, there's part of this that you can kind of sense a certain, again, like parody of empire, right? Like, usually when the empire wages war, the birds, the carrion birds, are invited to, feast on the battlefield or whatever. And that's like the empire kind of leaving destruction in its wake for no good reason. And so here you have the opposite. Who are the people who are left on the battlefield to be eaten? It's the kings, captains, the mighty, etc. All that stuff is pretty interesting. And, you kind of get the sense that they've like self-destructed in a weird way. And that's like their natural end. Like that part I could totally accept. And that's kind of what Richard wants to say, that Jesus has kind of undone their power. And so they fall on their own merit in a weird way. But the troubling bit that Richard doesn't talk about is in verse 18, where we learn that the birds are called to eat the flesh of all, both free and slave, both small and great. And I think that's the bit where I should have like consulted a commentary before talking today, but I feel like I'm confused about that bit.
Yeah, me too.
The only way I can make sense of it is Revelation does have this like extreme position of total negation of empire, right? Like John keeps saying you should even drop out of economic activity. You should like refuse the mark of the beast, don't buy and sell, and kind of accept the suffering that comes with not participating in economic life. And that is definitely a radical position. But there's an insinuation maybe that like the slave too is participating in that economic order in a complicated way, or the small and great alike are kind of equally deserving of the fate, I guess, of kind of compromising with empire. And I think that's like maybe not correct. Like I said, maybe like a commentary will have a more sophisticated opinion of that. But there is this kind of weird addition there where it's like not only the mighty and kings and so on, but everybody who's been part of the empire, they're all in trouble. So there's quite a maximalist position here.
If we were to read this as like the birds coming to feast on all these people, because this is like a product of the implosion of empire, like has been suggested previously, then I mean, I guess there's something in that sort of makes sense.
True,
but
yeah.
It's hard to know. It's hard to know, and Richard does not talk about it, which to me feels like, I don't want to say dishonest, but like convenient to skip over that part in particular when you're stitching together like a really particular narrative about this whole thing. I don't know.
Yeah. That
rubs me the wrong way, and I don't really know what to make of it. So there's that. Another interesting point, though, about this section is that Richard says, God invites the birds and wild animals of the field to a sacrifice to eat the flesh and blood of heroes, princes, warriors. Things are turned completely upside down. Those who are normally victims to be sacrificed, birds and wild animals, are invited as the persons to eat the sacrifice, while those who normally do the sacrificing are involved in the sacrifice as victims. Again, it's an interesting image, an interesting, I don't know, juxtaposition of things. Not exactly sure what to make of it all, but a good day for the birds nonetheless. They don't care one way or the other, I guess.
That's right. Well, I guess that's like one of the big things that we can put in our kind of like ongoing open questions that we may or may not solve this year. What the heck is going on with God's big yucky dinner? That's a good one to hold on to. So just to bring us back here, the judgment is happening. The beast, the prophet, the kings of the earth, they're all in trouble. Christ came on the white horse. He's got it solved. There's a great feast that's happening here. There is then this kind of war and annihilation that happens. That's all very complex, but I think something more interesting is kind of getting into the 1,000-year reign and the alternative here. We've talked a lot in the last several weeks about judgment and violence, etc. in Revelation, but the open question we've constantly had is kind of what's the alternative? What is the actual utopian vision that Revelation is giving. And we do finally get some really interesting insights into that. And I think this is where Richard actually shines in a cool way. So when he's not trying to smooth over the details of the text, but instead pull out the really radical interpretation of what's going on, there's a lot of cool material here. So let's get into that. Let's put away all the complicated stuff that makes me feel yucky and get into the stuff that is cool. Let me just start by setting up Richard's particular kind of goalposts for interpretation. He says that in general, the 1,000-year reign is, it kind of falls into two camps of interpretation, which he calls either fundamentalist or spiritualizing. So the fundamentalist interpretation, he says, reduces the text to its literal meaning. The 1,000-year reign will be a real reign of Christ with his church here on earth, a visible political reign with a history for 1,000 years before the Last Judgment. Christ's second coming will inaugurate this reign. The interpretation is common today within sectarian religious movements and in some neoconservative movements that are both political and religious. Okay, so this is the Left Behind crew and also some other kind of weirdos hanging around. This is the big Duos Remy or whatever dispensationalist Bible that your grandma has. Then there's the spiritualizing interpretation, by contrast, which he says reduces the text to its spiritual meaning. The 1,000-year reign is the time of the church between the resurrection of Jesus and the Last Judgment. The first resurrection is spiritual and takes place at baptism. Only the second resurrection is bodily. This interpretation is common in the historical churches, by which I guess he also means kind of mainline churches, and especially in the Catholic Church. And he really pins the responsibility for that interpretation on St. Augustine in particular. Fairly or unfairly, who could say? So what Richard wants to do instead is offer an interpretation that is neither fundamentalist, where it's so literal that there's an actual 1,000-year reign with, specific dates that will happen and so on, and on the other hand, that it's totally spiritual, that there's really no connection to history at all, and it's kind of a metaphor for the long sojourn that we have to deal with till Christ comes back. And what Richard wants to say is he actually has a profoundly historical interpretation of the 1,000-year reign, but not such a almost childishly literal interpretation of that reign. What do you think so far, Matt? How do you feel about avoiding these two goalposts?
I would love to avoid them as much as possible. I feel like I am in my brain that literal reading has loomed large for a very long time, and I feel like getting around it is very important to me. So I appreciate him pointing those things out. I don't know. If you've ever been into an evangelical church or you stuck around youth group a little too long or something, you've heard that literal reading before. And I think that if nothing else, even if we don't think that Richard is convincing on some of these points, or there's more complication, whatever, that's fine. But I think we can put to bed the literal reading a bit more, just based on his reading. Just the historical work that he's introducing, some of the exegesis that he's doing. It's pretty helpful for kind of undoing a lot of those very bad ideas, and I think that's extremely positive. So I'm happy about that. But I am more interested to talk about the 1,000-year reign. I guess that seems really cool. As socialism is a transition to communism, the 1,000-year reign is a transition to the true end of history, the true redemption of all people, and I think that's great. We can get into that.
All right. So I mean, that's actually not a bad metaphor. So good to bring it up. Here is how Richard talks about it. He says, the real and historical character of the utopia does not entail a literal and material interpretation of the 1,000-year reign, as we said. The 1,000-year reign is not a stage situated chronologically in history with exact beginning and end dates. It is a logic. It's the rationality or logic of what is to happen at the end of history. The vision is not chronological, but eschatological. We have here the meaning or ordering of what will happen when history reaches its fullness. Revelation 19:11-22:5 symbolically organizes the future, and it represents the utopia in a historical manner. It is a symbolic plan for transcendent hope. It is a utopian reconstruction of consciousness, a reconstruction of consciousness that takes its bearings from utopia. The meaning of Revelation is perverted and destroyed when we put dates on Jesus' parousia, the 1,000-year reign, or the misnamed end of the world. And he goes on to say that is idolatrous, Richard's favorite insult. So the question maybe then be, what is the content of that utopia? And don't worry, Richard also has some stuff about that, which I'll read here, and then we can break it down a little more together. He says, briefly, we may say that the 1,000-year reign is the utopia of all those who struggle against the idolatry and oppression of empires in order to establish God's reign on earth. It is the hope of a community that believes in a God who does justice now in history, a God who destroys empires and gives power to the people of the holy ones and the martyrs. In general, it's the utopia of the poor and oppressed that ultimately it's possible to bring about this order in this world, to restore the order of God, the Creator, and the liberating Messiah, Jesus. The utopia of the 1,000-year reign has nothing to do with the destructive and horrifying visions of the end of the world. This vision is not about the end of the world, but about a reign of God that ends the idolatry and criminality of empires in this world. It's not a passive utopia, since essential to it is that the martyrs, the holy ones, and all those who did not adore the beast and did not accept its mark be incorporated into the reign of the Messiah. It is not a violent and vengeful utopia, Richard says, for the martyrs arise to reign as a people of priests of God and Christ. They are not warriors, nor are they a power elite, since this is a priesthood encompassing the entire people of the saints. Okay, so a lot going on here, and you might say this is like an overly idealized interpretation of the biblical text, and you might be right about that. You're free to feel that way. But there is, I think, some actually pretty good textual reference for this, and if we remember what the book has said so far, it's not so far-fetched, which I think is really exciting. And in particular, the stuff that I want to call attention to, we noted in the beginning of Revelation, and as we've been reading in the last several weeks, that the people who've been killed by the empire, the martyrs, but even more broadly than that, not just Christians, all those who suffer from the empire, they ultimately are the ones who sit in judgment over the empire, and they also rule with Christ. They're kind of elevated to this position of authority. And in the vision of the 1,000-year reign, there's actually a first resurrection that happens. There's a resurrection of all the martyrs who've been beheaded in particular. They end up taking on roles as judges, kind of organizing the 1,000-year reign. And the way Richard reads that is to say it's finally the moment in which the sacrifice of the martyrs becomes the organizing principle of society, rather than the violence of the empire. And that seems consistent with me with when we think about some of the other kind of, I guess, readings of Jesus as being like the firstborn of the dead, or as you talked about earlier, the warrior whose cloak is dipped in the blood of the martyrs, this kind of alternative like authorization for who gets to be in power or in authority, is that you've gone through this kind of suffering and faithfulness to Christ. So that strikes me as very interesting. Matt, what do you think about this 1,000-year reign, this particular utopia in which the oppressed finally sit in a governing position over the oppressors?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think this is the thing that I think it comes down to in Revelation, and this is something we've been talking about the entire time, but it's like, is that transvaluation of values, of morals, or whatever the Nietzschean term is now, I can't remember, is it an expression of people who are transformed by that oppression and that liberation, or is it people who are out for vengeance, right? I guess that is always the question that is in the background of this conversation. So I suppose if we want to go with Richard and just be like, okay, no, they are people who are transformed. They are people who have the belt of truth on, the whole armor of God. They're people who are transformed by salvation and liberation, which I guess seems right, but it's just it's kind of hard to get your mind around. Then I don't know, very interesting, very exciting. You know what it makes me think of? This is a wild pull from 1,000 years ago, but a very long time ago on this podcast, we did read a book about women in the Zapatista movement, and how women will sit on, they'll be judges in the community. And it's this kind of interesting moment where people who are often at the sort of bottom socially, I guess, or in normal situations, are like, you know, then they become the judges of justice within a society. And it is, I don't know, kind of interesting in that capacity, where, yeah, I don't know, people who are oftentimes dispossessed now can pass judgment. But I guess, you know, how bloody it is always always a problem, always a concern. I don't know, Dean, what do you think about that side of things? I guess where do you feel like you're coming down on that question? Is this like, are martyrs being the judges, is that about retribution in a positive way or in a negative way?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think that the text is silent in itself, and maybe it's helpful even to read like the specific passage. It's not long that this comes from. So this is Revelation 24-6, I guess. Then I saw thrones, and those seated on them were given authority to judge. I also saw the souls of those who'd been beheaded for their testimony to Jesus and for the word of God. They had not worshipped the beast or its image, and had not received its brand on their foreheads or their hands. They came to life and reigned with Christ 1,000 years. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy are those who share in the first resurrection. Over these, the second death has no power, but they will be priests of God and of Christ, and they will reign with him 1,000 years. So exactly what they do, who could say? But they are the judges of society. And I think that, like, you know, you could read this maybe cynically or suspiciously as like the worst caricature of like how people read Marx's Dictatorship of the Proletariat as ultimately just like a, I don't know, inverting the relations of class terror or something like that. And I don't know, I guess I could understand that. But I think there is like a more nuanced perspective here. You know, the devil has been chained underground. Like the enemies are already kind of judged and held at bay temporarily. So it kind of seems to me like they serve the purpose of being, like I said, kind of the people who deserve authority in society, not because they're like, I don't know, out for blood or like whatever, but because they, you know, like they had the good judgment, the foresight to not participate in an exploitative empire. And so then those are the people you should trust to kind of govern a society that's not based on exploitation. So I feel like that's the revolutionary interpretation here, and maybe that speaks more to the Zapatista example that you brought up as well. But yeah, I feel like Richard has convinced me that there's like a cool dictatorship of the proletariat here, a peaceful one, like, you know, a moment where in order to have authority, you have to have rejected imperial authority, and that's kind of an interesting angle here.
Yeah, I'm not against the revolutionary reading that you're giving and that Richard is supporting. It's just like, I'm always very nervous because of the ways that Christians have, you know, done the whole thing throughout history, totally. Especially when it comes to judgment and retribution. And I think I'm right to be suspicious, is all I'm trying to say. Yeah. I will take up the revolutionary reading, of course, but just... always gonna look over my shoulder on this one. Okay, so we have the 1,000-year reign. The devil, he's underground, he's chained up, he can't get out, he's in the hardest escape room because he can't solve the puzzle, and after the 1,000-year reign, God has to let him out. That's the only way he can get out of this place. So God lets Satan loose. Satan goes and starts organizing all of the all of the worst people on the planet to start a war against God. And then what happens, Dean? What's the next beat in the story?
Okay. So this also, I think, is really fun to read in light of like revolutionary projects, because I couldn't help reading that part thinking also about like, I don't know, let's say, you know, you're Fidel Castro and you liberated Cuba and you destroyed Batista. You locked away the devil for 1,000 years. And finally, you're putting your government together and you're building an anti-imperialist state. And then what happens but the great Satan himself, the United States, begins to gather all the evil forces of the world to blockade you forever. I mean, that's kind of the, you know, an unfair, like, historical, bizarre eisegesis into this text. But it kind of struck me as like an interesting moment also of just recognizing that, you know, like, just because you're doing the virtuous government or something doesn't mean that the forces of evil have been defeated. So in Revelation, they all come back. The devil who had been imprisoned, he's back organizing all the enemies. And they march around the city and they get ready, and then in an extremely funny anticlimactic moment, fire comes down from heaven and consumes them all, and then that's it. That's the end. So they gather all that force and can't use it, and the people themselves are saved. Then finally, there's a great white throne, and there's all this kind of judgment that sort of happens cosmologically. So if the 1,000-year reign was kind of reorganizing human society, finally God delivers on an even deeper promise and judges death and Hades itself. So physical death and the underworld, they also get judged, they get defeated. And that kind of sets the stage for the coming down of God's final reign on earth, which is the descent of the new city, the New Jerusalem, down onto the earth. Matt, any other story beats that are really important before we talk about the final utopia of the Bible?
No, I think that those are the big ones. I have two important things to say about the heavenly city coming down to earth, though. Okay, first, it's described as a perfect square, and I cannot help but think about this big heavenly city being like God's city skyline city that he's like carved out perfectly from the map. All the connections are 100%. Yeah, traffic rating 100%. He's got all of the, he's taxing big industries. He's got the workers the workers union policy passed. It's great. Very funny. Anyways, it seems great. The other thing is this unlocked a deep-seated memory in my life, maybe negatively, I don't know. So we have this whole description of the heavenly city that we can talk about more in a minute, but it's the streets are paved with gold and so on. Man, I read this bit and I immediately thought of this time in youth group, and it was like a sort of a pre-youth group moment before I was a teen. It was a tween youth group. My God,
right?
Even worse. Anyways. There was a craft, and we built the heavenly city out of sugar cubes, and then we painted them. I know, man. So, anyways, I have a little bit of experience with this, if you think about it. Sort of a revolutionary activity that I never even knew about.
What a great divine city planner you've become. Yeah, well, let's talk about it. Let's talk about the great divine city plan, the ultimate city planner, city skyline city. So the New Jerusalem, Richard says, first of all, is a city. So this city descends from heaven, it comes to earth. Revelation no longer speaks of the Jerusalem of history, which had been destroyed in 70 CE, and which John regarded as comparable to Sodom and Egypt as symbols of Rome, since Jesus had been crucified in Jerusalem. In Revelation, Jerusalem is a myth, a symbol for the people of God or the community. In 11:1-2, the prophet John protects the community, symbolically called a holy city. In 14:1, Mount Zion also symbolizes the assembly site of the community of those who follow the Lamb. The symbol of Jerusalem as a city expresses community, people, humankind organized. Today we might speak of social relationships or a vision or model of society. Chapter 21 opens with two visions. John first sees a new heaven and a new earth, a new cosmos or nature. He then sees a new city, the holy city of Jerusalem, a new society or humankind organized, and we thus have a coupling of cosmos and city that combines the two dimensions of human history, nature, and humankind. History is not limited to being a society of men and women, but also includes the cosmos or nature. The new cosmos and humankind are bodily. Transcendence, as we've said, means overcoming death, chaos, and darkness, not overcoming bodiliness and history. In the new world created by God, there is bodiliness and social relations, but they are now without death, chaos, darkness, and oppression. So we can say more about the actual social organization of the city, because there is more to say in a moment. But the key for Richard is that the final city is not like going up to heaven and then kind of like being, I don't know, being like a perfect spherical ball, as people who listen to the Magnificast lock-in might remember. Instead, it's about the city coming to earth. And what we find, too, is that the specific organization of that city, again, parodies a lot of what happens in Rome. And you mentioned the streets paved with gold. There's actually a really funny bit about that. Richard notes that that's a kind of, again, revaluation of values. It's like showing that what was once this kind of extremely precious metal is now instead the kind of thing that you put your feet on. It's like, you walk around on it. It's useless. It's a building material. It reminded me actually of this. Have you ever read that wild essay on gold by Lenin from the 1920s?
Whoa, I don't think so.
Okay. It is a really funny, almost direct, comparison to the Book of Revelation. He wrote it in 1921, so after the revolution had succeeded. And he says this: "When we are victorious on a world scale, I think that we shall use gold for the purpose of building public lavatories in the streets of some of the largest cities of the world. This would be the most just and most educational way of utilizing gold for the benefit of these generations, which have not forgotten how, for the sake of gold, 10 million men were killed and 30 million maimed in the Great War for Freedom, the War of 1914 to 18. The war was waged to decide the great question of which peace was the worst, that of Brest or that of Versailles, and how, for the sake of this same gold, they certainly intend to kill 20 million men and maim 60 million in a war, say, in 1925 or 28, between, say, Japan and the USA, or between Britain and the USA, or something like that. One last bit here. But however just, useful, or humane it would be to utilize gold for this purpose, we nevertheless say that we must work for another decade or two with the same intensity and same success as in the 1917 to 21 period." So Lenin's final, vision is like, we should build our toilets out of gold, because that will also remind us how shitty it is to kill people over this extremely useless and stupid material. And I think that is, the final vision of biblical and material socialism is the money that we once kind of organized all this violence to secure and accumulate. Finally, that's emptied out into a society that has no use for that kind of power, that kind of circulation. So there's a lot of interesting things going on here, I think, in this extremely material utopia of the New Jerusalem.
Yeah, extremely interesting. So gold is worthless, right? We're walking around on it. Who cares? We're gonna make the golden toilet. I'm sure that that is exactly what we would do in the New Jerusalem. Seems great. But there's also a lot of other interesting things going on in the ways that we will attend to our bodily needs. And this is not a poop joke, so don't even think about it. So in Revelation 21:6, God says, "To the thirsty I will give a gift from the spring of life-giving water." The same thing is said in the community liturgy that's in 22:17. Water here symbolizes the life that God offers to all those who seek it. The interesting thing is that it is offered as a gift. That is, money has nothing to do with it. It is God who assures life, not the market. And then Richard says that this is all kind of reflecting Isaiah, who says, "All you who are thirsty, come to the water. You who have no money, come receive grain and eat. Come without paying, without cost, drink wine and milk." The vision of the New Jerusalem is also one without money, one where the things that you need for life are just kind of given to you as a gift. Wild. Richard kind of concludes the thought saying, "This is the utopia of those prevented from eating and drinking and from leading a secure life, those without money. Now in Revelation, this is the ultimate life, guaranteed by God beyond death and oppression." Good stuff. There's no money in heaven. I think that is part of the deep lore of the Magnificast lock-in, but I can't really remember. Another cool thing I think that I thought was quite interesting that Richard says about the New Jerusalem is that there's no temple. There's no temple in the whole place. So it's just it's a big square city. There's no unlockable temple building to put in the middle of the big city skylines, perfect city. And that is interesting because that means that God is just kind of there living with everybody. There's not a place where God lives. It's just, he's in there doing his thing. But an interesting observation that Richard then makes is, since there is no temple in the New Jerusalem, all these distinctions and differences vanish. Distinctions between holy and profane, priest and layperson, Christian and non-Christian likewise vanish. Now the whole city is holy, all are priests, and all see God and hear God's name and bear God's name on their forehead. So there's a type of universalism present in the New Jerusalem, but there's also some important exclusions from people in the New Jerusalem as well. Kind of it's interesting, right? So you have the martyrs, you have all the people who've suffered for the Lord, literally, and they're all there without distinction. But there are all kinds of people who Richard mentions are excluded from the New Jerusalem and also destroyed forever. which is I guess I want to pull out because I don't know. It's an interesting dialogue with types of universalism and the ways that people construe that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
But Richard notes that in 21:8, 27, and 22:15, there's a list of all the people who are excluded from the New Jerusalem, destroyed. And here's the list. Here's the BuzzFeed listicle of people who won't be in the New Jerusalem. So the first one are the cowards. And he references the word that's used in this part of Revelation is the same word that's used in Matthew 8:26 when Jesus calms the storm and he's preaching to the disciples and he says, why are you terrified? And when he says terrified to the disciples, it's the same word as cowards in Revelation. He says, in this context of Revelation, it refers to one who fails to resist the beast's the lack of faith and courage, one who does not have the strength and faith to give public witness, even with martyrdom. The people who do not want others to know that they are a Jesus freak. The next one on the list are I'm not going to read the descriptions for all of these, but they're kind of interesting nonetheless. The people who are unfaithful, the people who are depraved, and this is an interesting one because you could construe that in some probably negative ways. But Richard says those given to depravity or abomination, and then he says the desolating abomination, which I think we talked about in a previous episode, which was the idol that the Romans placed in the temple. The depraved are those who worship the oppressive idol. So the people who worship oppression, that particular type of idolatry. The murderers, they're out. He also mentions the prostitutes, but again, this is at least as Richard tells it, this is not about the act of sex work. This is about people who become an object in the hand of another who pays them. So this is about another type of like particular idolatry. The sorcerers, which is a bummer. Tell Harry Potter, he's not in. And then finally, idol worshippers. It says in the Bible, an idolater is one who perverts the meaning of God or who substitutes other gods like money, power, the market, etc. for God. He also does note really quickly, an important note. He lists a few kind of like biblical examples of this type of idolatry within the New Testament. And he says in the New Testament, idolatry is almost always connected to money. So important things. Anyways, I think I guess I want to bring it up because there's maybe a little bit of uncomfortableness with it. There's a sense I think that some people have about universalism and what happens to everybody at the end of all things or whatever. And not that this is like a map, but I guess it's just really interesting that there is a specific set of exclusions, like that there is a real sense of justice and there's like something at stake here. It's not that everybody comes back in the end or everyone is actually acceptable. There are people who are, unacceptable. They don't get to go into the city. A really interesting bit, I guess, at the very end here.
Yeah. And I think that is interesting because it does pull together the through line that idolatry is the thing that John is most concerned about. It's what he opens the book with. He's complaining to all these other churches for kind of trading their loyalty to God to loyalty for Rome. And I think Richard does kind of land the plane here by saying ultimately Revelation is a book about resisting idolatry. And, he puts a fine point on it by being like, not only will God spit you out of his mouth in this moment, but also at the end of time. So, that's the fate you're trying to avoid. Like, you want to be there in the new city, but there's no room for people who continue to idolize or fetishize getting power through exploitation and violence. So that's pretty interesting. That's the qualifier for whether or not you can enter into the city. One last bit that I think is really interesting. So the book of Revelation absorbs, as we've said before, all this prophetic and apocalyptic literature, including themes like beasts and representing empires as beasts and all that kind of stuff that's present in Daniel and other stuff in Ezekiel and Isaiah. So you can see that the author of Revelation is really kind of a student of biblical prophetic tradition. And that also happens when we talk about the New Jerusalem. And Richard has a cool bit where he kind of pulls on some other threads of the New World and New Jerusalem in the Old Testament. And there's a great moment where he points out the Old Testament passage closest to Revelation 21 to 22 is Isaiah 65, 17 to 25. Its opening line is, "Lo, I am about to create new heavens and a new earth." This cosmic sign is explained in social terms: rejoicing and happiness in Jerusalem and its people, an end to weeping and crying, the promise of a long life. No longer shall there be in it an infant who lives but a few days. He dies a mere youth who reaches but 100 years. Exploitation is overcome. They shall live in the houses they build and eat the fruits of the vineyards they plant. They should not build houses for others to live in, no landlords in heaven, or plant for others to eat, no labor exploitation, no proletarianization in heaven. They shall long enjoy the produce of their hands. They shall not toil in vain. And nearness to God. Before they call, I will answer. And then cosmic and social peace. The wolf and the lamb shall graze alike. So that is all kind of in the background here of also how John is like pulling in this thread of a new heavens and a new earth. Like, he doesn't invent that idea. He kind of builds on top of all the stuff that's come before. The big difference that Richard says is about a world without oppression, but also a world without death. There's no chaos or darkness. And this is the kind of transcendent moment for Richard. That not only do we finally escape the oppressive kind of relations that foreshorten our lives or that make us toil for other people, but we also have this kind of redemption of the entirety of the cosmos. And that also vindicates the martyrs who've been killed by the Empire. So I think that's really interesting. There is this kind of like added, you might call it a spiritualization or something like that, the defeat of death. But I think what Richard wants to say is that, in fact, it's a kind of even greater material aspiration of like overcoming all the forces of death and violence, including death itself. It's like a extreme hyperbolic vision of what it would mean to truly live in a redeemed new heavens and earth. So that I think is also really interesting, just seeing too how he's pulling forward all this other biblical material to envision a utopia that I think is pretty undeniably a socialist vision of society, which I think is pretty remarkable.
I agree. I feel the same way. I mean, it's like, it's very funny to read this and not think of like the dialectical like resolution of tensions in history or something, the real movement of the abolition of the present state of things or something. Like, this is it. this is all of that kind of coming to a head and then being resolved. Yeah, man, I don't know. It seems like communism to me. Whatever. Fine.
Yeah. A very weird communism for sure, but one where you can't even die. Seems like a pretty good deal.
Oh, man. Wow. Well, we gotta find new games to play, new Xboxes to have, if I can't die ever. Dean, there's a lot going on here, and we've already gone far over the time that we've usually allotted for this kind of thing. I do really want to quickly get to the conclusion that Richard brings out. So we've kind of talked about some of this already. I guess I just want to have this be sort of the concluding moment, because I think it's helpful. So Richard says, Revelation teaches us also how to live the past as a history of salvation, and to ask how the history... Revelation teaches us to live the past as a history of salvation, and to ask how that history is taking place today. But most important is to interpret Revelation so that we can correctly confront the future, and so overcome all the manipulation that creates anguish, fear, and terror. Revelation teaches us to imagine the present and final eschatology with a sense of joy and hope. Okay. That's Richard's conclusion. That's what Revelation should teach us to do. Do you feel like he's achieved this goal? Is that what, now that you know all of these things, are you thinking about the final eschatology with a sense of joy and hope?
Great question. I mean, I do think there is something to that. Like, I feel like having a proper understanding of Revelation, that's what Richard wants to achieve here. It does kind of at least give you this like reminder that the pretension of global empire is only a pretension. It is 666. It will never actually be 7. You know, the minute it tries to achieve 7, it will lose and try to make an 8th head, and it will be destroyed. Like, all that kind of insane way of talking about that, I think is kind of cool to be like, there's a really, really deep faith and hope that the last word of the empire, which is to try to literally kill people, to sort of end that line of a belief in an alternative, that word is not the final word, that there's something else after that. And I think that's like a kind of vision of the future I can really hold on to. And similar, what does that look like? What does it look like to imagine an alternative city of God? It would be one where, we walk around on gold because it's a useless material for us, where you can have your needs met. It kind of begins to outline the alternative that we ought to be anticipating when the empire is gone in our own moment. So I would say, yes, it does fill me with a sense of joy and hope. It fills me with a lot of confusion and a lot of uncomfortable images that are sort of nightmare fuel. But besides all that, I do think that the overarching anti-imperialist division that ends in a socialist society is pretty cool to see in the Bible.
Yeah, I agree. I feel kind of the same way. Confusion, definitely part of the mix. Can't get rid of that. And fair enough, that's fine. This book is written for somebody else that's not me in a time that is not now. But I do appreciate I what you're saying about the future seems right. That there is a world other than this. There's a sort of like there is another possibility in terms of like the way that human society can be structured and how we can live kind of free of the horrors of capitalism. The other part that I do really like, though, about this, about Richard's reading of Revelation, the way he's kind of presented it, is the idea that there is the past history of salvation, and that we're living kind of in light of that, I guess, is quite interesting. That there are people who have suffered against the idolatry of empire before us, and there will be people who suffer against the idolatry of empire after us, and we are somehow caught up in that long history of people suffering against idolatry and empire. Maybe there is something kind of like reassuring that we all 144,000 of the white robe martyrs who've already gone before us or whatever, we're kind of I don't want to like overblow our role in like this anti-imperial struggle or something, but we're adjacent to them. We're the 12 million gray robed people who are only kind of sort of struggling or something. But to kind of have that sort of historical breadth of recognizing whose side that you are trying to be on is, I think, kind of nice as well.
Yeah, I mean, it really speaks to that essay we talk about all the time by Ignacio Ellacuría about the crucified people. Like Christ died on the cross, but not in order to be the only person that we ever recognized as a victim of imperialism, but on the contrary, to kind of signal the ultimate valuation of those who are killed by imperialism, and to have faith that could build a kind of collective based on the victims of empire rather than the victors of empire. I think that really is a profound point. Cool to have that out of Richard. I think the open questions are probably the ones that we flagged at the beginning. Like the violence in Revelation still is uncomfortable to me. The desire for vengeance, I feel, is confusing. The gender violence and the way that women in particular are kind of construed in the text doesn't sit well with me. And I thought Richard actually kind of backed down from those items for probably good strategic reason. I don't know. He's trying to like make this book activate base communities in Latin America and whatever. I guess he felt that's something he had to do. But those are things that I want to figure out maybe with some other readings of Revelation over time. But ultimately, I think the one thing that Richard really did convince me of is that this is a book that is like about a maximal resistance to imperialism, and it's generating a ton of insane, bizarre, mythological, symbolic language. Because if you're stuck in empire, the only language you have available to you is imperial language. So you've got to invent new language. You've got to draw on previous anti-imperialist literature or literary trends and tropes to sort of cobble together some alternative. So that I found really cool and exciting and inspiring. And it makes me want to read like, I don't know, leftist fiction or something, like it's kind of this is basically like early Christian science fiction. I think that's very cool.
Yeah, I guess that sounds right. Yeah, it's interesting for all those reasons. I guess it's helping me understand the Bible better in sort of a deeper sense. We've read Herzog, we've read Richard Horsley, and now we're reading this book from Pablo Richard, and each one of them kind of pulling out and emphasizing the themes of imperialism, themes of struggle, themes of peasants who are trying to organize and do something different in the world in light of imperial violence, and I think that there's something really activating about understanding the Bible this way. That does, I don't know. It makes me feel a lot differently about Christianity. That there's like a new line of inquiry for me within Christianity that I maybe didn't quite have the handles for before reading this as well. So it's nice to know that there's more within this faith tradition to think about, and it's not all just like bad stuff I'm trying to get rid of.
That's right. All right. So we are gonna talk more about Revelation later this year. I don't know. Maybe we'll take a few episodes off. Who could say? We'll find out. Off of Revelation in particular. But we're sticking with it. It's still the end of the world. We've got to figure out what to do with this very weird book at the end of the Bible. And yeah, I don't know. We've got a whole list of stuff. I feel like every time I go looking for a new thing about Revelation, I find there's some other weirdo who's written an even weirder book about it. So we'll find some of the weird stuff. I feel like we have a good understanding of the Bible, and maybe we're like freer to start dealing with all the bizarre interpretations of it over time. So we'll see where we get by the end of the year. But I don't know, Matt, any final hope for what we can do with this book, this biblical book?
Man, I don't know, not a hope, but I have been telling like everybody I meet about it. After we get past small talk, I just basically go into, I'm reading this insane book about Revelation. Do you want to hear about it? And they are always pretty interested. So I don't know, man. Tell your friends about what's going on in Revelation. It's the book that everyone is so curious about. And then when you find out what it's actually about, it is, I think, more interesting than Left Behind. So there's a lot going for it.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you should buy our book, Enough is Enough, Degrowth, Capitalism, and Liberation Theology. Would you believe we even cite Pablo Richard in that book and talk about idolatry and all kinds of other stuff? And you can find it wherever you like to get books. It's published by Fortress Press. You can get it from them directly. You can get it from your local bookstore. You can request it at your library. Do whatever you want, but it would really help us out if you got a copy of this book. We should have said this at the beginning. We also created a study guide for the book, and it will take you and your weird church group through this book, chapter by chapter. It is available for free at tinyurl.com/enoughisenoughbook. And you can download it and kind of get a sneak peek maybe of what's going on. It comes out officially May 12th, but people have been getting it early already. Not Matt and I, which is driving us both absolutely insane. But some people have it in their hands, and that's cool. You can also support us on Patreon at patreon.com/themagnificast. If you do that, you can join our Discord community, where people are talking about all kinds of interesting and fun stuff. May Day happened recently, so lots of cool sharing about what's going on and how people are organizing, and it's a great space to hang out and chat about all kinds of things. Our music is by Amaria Armstrong, and our outro is by The Illogical Spoon, and we'll see you next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon.